12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos by Byjordan B. Peterson. A sleepy summary. As you settle in and let the day go quiet, this summary is offered as a soft doorway into the world Byjordan Peterson built with care and considerable courage. Nothing here is meant to replace the full weight of the original work, only to walk beside you gently as your eyes grow heavy, and perhaps leave a small ember of curiosity that draws you, in daylight, back to the book itself. The real treasure lives in Peterson's own words, in the stories he tells, the questions he refuses to look away from, and the hard, loving honesty he brings to the oldest question any of us can ask: how should a human being actually live? Byjordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist and professor who spent decades thinking about human behavior, mythology, religion, Jungian psychology, and the nature of good and evil before writing this book. It emerged partly from his experiences as a therapist listening to people's suffering, partly from his years of teaching at Harvard and the University of Toronto, and partly from his own personal struggles and observations about what makes people fall apart and what occasionally makes them come back together again. The book is ambitious, almost extravagantly so, because Peterson doesn't just want to give you tips for getting organized or being more productive. He wants to tell you something true about the nature of existence itself, something about suffering and meaning and responsibility, and then hand you 12 concrete rules to live by that emerge naturally from those truths. The book begins, as many good things do, with lobsters. Peterson opens by telling us about the neurochemistry of dominance hierarchies in lobsters. Now you might think, what could lobsters possibly have to do with my life? And the answer Peterson gives is, quite a lot, actually. Lobsters have been around for hundreds of millions of years. They fight for territory, for mates, for the best positions in the ocean. The winners of those fights carry themselves differently. They stand tall, spread out, take up space, and their brains are flooded with serotonin, the neurochemical associated with confidence and well-being. The losers shrink, curl up, retreat, and their serotonin levels drop. What's remarkable is that the same basic neurochemical system exists in human beings. The same ancient architecture that governs how a lobster holds its body after winning or losing a confrontation governs, in significant ways, how a human being carries themselves through the world. This is Peterson's first and deepest point. Hierarchy is not a social construct invented by capitalism or the patriarchy. It is ancient. It is biological. It is woven into the very fabric of living things. And the position you occupy in the hierarchy, whether you're at the top or the bottom, whether you're flourishing or struggling, affects everything about your physiology, your mood, your perception of the world, and your ability to navigate it. When you're high in the hierarchy, the world looks like a place of opportunity and possibility. When you're low, everything feels threatening, uncertain, and exhausting. And this brings Peterson to his first rule, which is delivered with a kind of almost tender seriousness. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. This is not, he insists, merely advice about posture. It is advice about how to engage with existence. To stand up straight with your shoulders back means to face life voluntarily, to stop shrinking from its demands, to stop apologizing for taking up space, to stop conveying to the world and to yourself that you expect to be treated poorly. When you slouch, when you make yourself small, when you avoid eye contact and speak in a mumble, You are signaling to everyone around you and to the ancient neural structures within you that you have already lost, that you are at the bottom, that you deserve less. And the world, in its harsh indifference, tends to respond accordingly. But when you pull your shoulders back and lift your head and meet the world's gaze, something changes. Not just in how others perceive you, but in how you perceive yourself and in how your brain begins to function. He's not being naive here. He knows that some people are genuinely in very difficult circumstances, genuinely suffering, genuinely oppressed. But his argument is that even in those circumstances, perhaps especially in those circumstances, the decision to stand up straight, to present yourself to the world as someone who has not been entirely defeated, is one of the most powerful things you can do. It's the beginning of the path back up. And the idea of paths back up, of redemption and recovery, and the long, slow climb out of chaos, runs through the entire book like a thread. Let's drift now into the second rule, which begins with a question Peterson often asked his patients. If you saw a friend treating themselves the way you treat yourself, what would you think? Most people, he found, treated themselves with a harshness they would never apply to another person. They spoke to themselves with contempt. They made decisions about their own care, their diet, their sleep, their medical treatment, their rest, that they would never allow for someone they loved. Peterson was struck in his clinical work by how many people actually don't take care of themselves, not out of laziness, but out of a kind of deep, unexamined self-contempt. They don't feel they deserve care. They feel on some level that they are fundamentally bad or broken or unworthy of the effort. This leads to the second rule: treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Peterson is careful here. He's not telling you to be selfish or to prioritize yourself above all others. He's not peddling the gospel of self-care in the shallow modern sense. He's saying something stranger and more profound, that you have a responsibility to yourself, that you are a person of genuine value who exists in the world and has a role to play in it, and that neglecting yourself, failing to eat properly, failing to rest, failing to pursue what gives your life meaning, is not humble, it is a failure of duty. He brings in the biblical story of the fall here, and this is something you'll notice throughout the book. Peterson is deeply engaged with mythology and religious narrative, not necessarily as literal truth, but as repositories of ancient wisdom about human nature. The fall of Adam and Eve, he suggests, represents the emergence of self-consciousness. When humans became aware of themselves, they became aware of their own vulnerability, their own mortality, their own capacity for evil. And there's a sense in which we are all, on some level, ashamed of what we are, ashamed of the knowing creature that we became when we bit the apple. And that shame, that ancient Edenic embarrassment, is part of why we find it hard to care for ourselves the way we would care for others. The path forward, Peterson says, is to recognize that you are simultaneously something fallen and something capable of rising. You contain the capacity for both tremendous good and tremendous harm. And because you are a person with potential value in the world, you have an obligation to bring forth the good, which means taking care of the instrument yourself, through which that good must come. By now your eyes might be getting heavy, and that's exactly right. Let the words wash over you. We are not in a hurry. The third rule arrives in a chapter full of stories about people Peterson knew or treated, people who, despite their own struggles and failures, somehow manage to surround themselves with other struggling, failing people rather than with those who are doing better. Peterson calls this the problem of the bad friend, and his rule is, make friends with people who want the best for you. This sounds simple, almost too simple, but Peterson unpacks it with real care. He talks about people he grew up with in a small town in northern Alberta, boys who seemed trapped by circumstance, by the culture of low expectations, by the implicit group norm that said ambition was pretentious and escape was betrayal. Some of them, he says, remained stuck not because they lacked intelligence or ability, but because the social group they were part of did not want them to rise. When someone in that group tried to improve themselves, they were pulled back down. Mockery, resentment, the subtle social punishment that groups inflict on members who try to leave. He makes a distinction here that matters. There is a difference between helping someone who genuinely wants help and is working towards something, and allowing yourself to be used as a prop for someone's self-destruction. Real compassion, Peterson argues, sometimes requires refusing to enable, and surrounding yourself with people who are dragging you down, or people whose lives are in chaos and who have no intention of addressing it, is not an act of loyalty or kindness. It is often a way of excusing your own failure to try. When you choose to spend your time with people who challenge you, who have high standards, who genuinely want to see you succeed, something changes. Their expectations become part of your environment. Their belief in you becomes a resource. Their accountability becomes a mirror. This is not about snobbishness or abandoning people in need. It's about recognizing that you are, in part, a product of who you surround yourself with, and taking that seriously. Then comes one of the most psychologically interesting rules in the book, and one that Peterson says people most frequently misunderstand. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. In an age of social media, this rule cuts right to the heart of a very modern misery. We live in a world of infinite visible comparison. On any given day, you can see someone who is richer than you, more successful than you, better looking than you, more admired than you, fitter than you, happier than you. And the ancient hierarchical machinery in your brain, which evolved to measure your position in a small local tribe of maybe 150 people, is suddenly being exposed to the entire global spectrum of human achievement and attractiveness simultaneously. The result is a kind of comparison paralysis, a constant low-level despair at not being enough, because there is always someone doing better than you somewhere. Peterson's solution is not to stop caring about progress. It's to redirect the measuring stick. Instead of asking whether you are better than someone else, ask whether you are better than you were yesterday, last week, last year. This is a much more useful and honest question, because it is the only comparison you have any real control over. You cannot control who else exists in the world or how talented or fortunate they are. You can, in some measure, control what you do with the hours and days and years of your own life. He also talks in this chapter about the way the inner critic, that voice in your head that judges your every action and finds it wanting, can become a kind of tyrant if not managed carefully. The inner critic serves a function. It helps us evaluate ourselves and improve. But when it becomes relentlessly harsh, when it holds every small act up against an impossible standard, and finds it worthless, it begins to destroy motivation rather than cultivate it. Peterson's advice is to negotiate with that inner voice, to engage with it, to take its criticism seriously, but not absolutely, to say, yes, I could have done that better, but I also did some things well, and here is what I will try tomorrow. Rule 5 is one that parents will recognize immediately, and it arrives in a chapter full of genuine tenderness and psychological insight. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Peterson's argument here is against the kind of permissive parenting that became fashionable in the latter half of the 20th century, the philosophy that said children should be allowed to express themselves freely, that discipline was a form of oppression, that any correction of behavior risked damaging the child's self-esteem. He finds this philosophy not only misguided, but in a very real sense, cruel. He tells a story about a small child he once observed in a restaurant who was behaving terribly, screaming, throwing food, disrupting everyone around, treating the parents with contempt, while the parents watched with a mixture of helplessness and what Peterson read as genuine exhaustion and even dislike. And he makes the point that children are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional responses of the adults around them. If a child behaves in a way that causes the adults who love them most to subtly recoil, to feel something approaching dislike, the child registers that at some deep level. Far from building self-esteem, being allowed to be obnoxious and monstrous builds in children a sense of unease, a feeling that they are somehow dangerous and uncontrollable, and that no one around them is strong enough to set limits. Children, Peterson argues, actually want limits. They want to know that there are people in their world who are strong enough, caring enough, and paying enough attention to say no when no needs to be said. The absence of those limits is not freedom. It is a kind of abandonment. It says, in effect, that no one is minding the store, that there is no structure to the world, that chaos reigns, and for a child that is terrifying. He is careful to distinguish between discipline that is genuinely caring and discipline that is punitive or cruel. The goal is never to hurt the child. The goal is to teach the child the social rules they will need to function in the world, rules that other children and adults will absolutely enforce, even if the parents don't, often much more harshly. A parent who disciplines a child gently but firmly is actually performing an act of love, preparing that child for a world that will not make exceptions. The sixth rule is one of Peterson's most counterintuitive and philosophically rich. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. This chapter begins with a meditation on some of the worst events in recent history: school shootings, acts of mass violence, and Peterson asks a question that most people shy away from. What does the perpetrator of such an act actually think they're doing? In many cases, he says, they have convinced themselves that the world is so corrupt, so fundamentally unjust, so irredeemably fallen, that their violence is a kind of logical conclusion, a refusal to participate in the lie. They have appointed themselves judges of existence and found it wanting. Peterson is not sympathetic to this reasoning. He finds it monstrous. But he is interested in tracing the logic because it represents an extreme version of something many people engage in to a lesser degree: the habit of blaming the world for one's own misery, the habit of surveying one's failures and concluding that the system is rigged, that other people are at fault, that society is the problem. There is, he acknowledges, plenty wrong with the world. Society is imperfect. Institutions are flawed. Injustice is real. But the person who devotes themselves to cataloguing the world's failures as a way of avoiding the examination of their own life is engaged in a particularly seductive form of self-deception. Before you try to fix the world, Peterson says, look around at your own life. Look at the chaos you have allowed to accumulate in your personal domain, the relationships you have neglected, the promises you have broken, the habits you have failed to build, the small daily acts of dishonesty or avoidance you have permitted. Start there. Not because the world's problems are unimportant, but because you cannot see the world clearly through the fog of your own unaddressed failures. And also because the world, in a very real sense, is made up of people, and every person who gets their own house in order makes the world, by that much, a better place. This rule, like all of Peterson's rules, is delivered not as a criticism, but as a kind of serious, loving challenge. He believes in the capacity of people to improve. He would not have written this book if he didn't. But he also believes that improvement requires honesty, and that honesty begins with yourself. Now let's ease into the seventh rule, which takes us into the territory of meaning and truth in a way that feels almost like a bedtime story about the nature of reality. Rule 7. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. This is perhaps the most philosophically ambitious chapter in the book. Peterson draws on a wide range of sources: Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Jungian psychology, the Book of Genesis, to build an argument about why suffering is not the worst thing that can happen to a human being, and why meaning, properly understood, is the antidote to suffering rather than its absence. He begins with a simple observation: life involves suffering. This is unavoidable. People you love will die. You will get sick. You will fail at things you care about. Plans will fall through. Relationships will end. The body will betray you. None of this can be escaped. The question is not whether you will suffer, but what you will do with your suffering, whether you will let it crush you into nihilism and resentment, or whether you will find in it the raw material of something meaningful. The expedient thing, the thing that provides short-term relief, that numbs the pain, that avoids the difficult confrontation, is always available. You can drink, you can avoid, you can lie, you can blame. You can distract yourself endlessly with pleasure and entertainment. But none of these expedient things make the suffering go away. They only delay and often amplify it. And more importantly, they cut you off from the deep river of meaning that runs beneath human life, and that is, Peterson believes, the only real source of genuine satisfaction. Meaning, he argues, is found in the voluntary taking on of responsibility. It is found in the sacrifice of the present for the future, in the ancient insight represented in virtually every religious and cultural tradition, that you have to give up something now in order to receive something better later. The person who studies instead of parties is enacting this logic. The parent who stays up with a sick child is enacting it. The individual who tells a hard truth instead of a comfortable lie is enacting it. In each case, something small and immediately pleasurable is given up in service of something larger and more durable. And here Peterson does something very interesting. He connects this idea of sacrifice to the concept of God. The highest possible sacrifice, The greatest possible act of meaning-making is to orient your life toward the good in its most fundamental sense, to commit yourself to truth, to genuine care for others, to the ongoing improvement of yourself and your world. This is what it means, he suggests, to live a religious life in the deepest sense, regardless of whether you hold specific theological beliefs. Rule 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Peterson distinguishes between the active lie, the false statement made to deceive, and the more common and perhaps more corrosive dishonesty of simply failing to say what you actually think, failing to live in accordance with your own values, failing to acknowledge to yourself what you actually believe. He calls this latter form of dishonesty betrayal by omission, or drawing on Jungian concepts, a kind of refusal to live authentically. He talks about something he observed in his clinical practice. When people lie, when they shape their speech and behavior not around what they genuinely believe and value, but around what they think others want to hear, around what will keep them safe and approved of, they gradually lose their own moorings. They become uncertain about what they actually think. They develop a kind of internal fog, a confusion about their own identity and values that makes every decision harder and every relationship more fraught. The lie, in other words, is not just morally wrong, it is psychologically destructive to the liar. And he makes a larger argument about the relationship between truth and order. A society, a relationship, a personal life built on lies is built on a foundation that cannot hold. The lies accumulate, each requiring more lies to support it, until the whole structure becomes so fragile that any pressure will collapse it. Whereas a life built on truth, even painful truth, even truth that costs you something, is built on bedrock. It may be harder in the short term, it may require more courage, but it is stable in a way that the edifice of lies can never be. He tells a story about a client who spent years telling everyone, including himself, that he was fine, that his marriage was fine, that his career was fine, when in fact everything was deeply not fine. And the gradual, painful process of learning to say what was actually true, to admit, first to himself and then to others, what he actually felt and believed and wanted, was the turning point of that person's life. Not comfortable, not easy, but real. Peterson's advice is not to become brutally, tactlessly honest in a way that wounds everyone around you. He is not advocating for the person who says, "I'm just being honest," as a cover for cruelty. He is advocating for the practice of aligning your speech with your genuine understanding of reality, of saying the thing you believe to be true even when it would be easier to say something else, of building your life on the solid, unmovable foundation of what is actually the case. Rule 9 brings us into the territory of listening, and it is one of the most quietly powerful chapters in the book. The rule is, assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Peterson talks about the way most people listen in conversation, not to understand, but to reply. They are waiting for a gap in the other person's speech in order to say what they already planned to say, what they had already decided was true before the conversation began. This is not listening. This is merely taking turns talking. And it means that conversation, which could be one of the most powerful tools for learning and growth available to human beings, is instead just two people bouncing their existing beliefs off each other and each going home unchanged. Real listening, Peterson says, is much rarer and much more difficult. It requires the genuine suspension of the assumption that you already know what the other person is going to say. It requires treating the other person as a source of genuine information, as someone who might have a perspective or an experience or a piece of knowledge that you don't have, and that could actually change your mind if you let it. He talks about the Socratic method here, the practice of genuine dialogue as a path toward truth. Socrates was famous for claiming to know nothing and for asking questions with genuine curiosity rather than leading questions designed to confirm what he already believed. This posture of humble inquiry, Peterson suggests, is the posture of the person who is actually interested in the truth rather than merely in being right. There is something deeply restful about being genuinely listened to. Most of us go through much of our lives not feeling heard, not feeling that anyone is really paying attention to what we are saying and genuinely trying to understand it. When someone does listen that way, it is transformative. And Peterson suggests that by practicing this kind of listening ourselves, we not only learn more, but we become the kind of person that others feel safe talking to, which deepens every relationship we have. The clinical dimension of this rule is important. Peterson spent years sitting with people in profound distress, listening to their suffering and their confusion, and what he found was that very often the act of being listened to, truly listened to, without judgment, without interruption, without the listener rushing to fix or advise, was itself therapeutic. People would work out their own problems in the course of being heard. They would hear themselves say things they had never quite put into words before and suddenly understand something they had been confused about for years. The listener in this model is not passive. The quality of their attention is what creates the space in which understanding can emerge. Rule 10. Be precise in your speech. This chapter is about the relationship between language and reality, and it begins with an observation that will feel familiar to anyone who has been in a troubled relationship. The problem that isn't talked about gets worse. The difficult conversation that keeps being avoided gathers power the longer it is left unaddressed. The vague sense of unease that is never quite brought into focus becomes a monster lurking in the shadows of your life, consuming energy and poisoning everything it touches. Peterson argues that most of the chaos in people's lives is sustained by imprecision, by the refusal to define the problem clearly, to say exactly what is wrong, to identify specifically what needs to change. It is easier to live with a vague general unhappiness than to say clearly and precisely, this specific thing is wrong and needs to be addressed. Because once you say it clearly, you can no longer pretend you don't know it. You are obligated to deal with it, and that is uncomfortable. But precision, Peterson says, is an act of power. When you can name a thing clearly, when you can say exactly what the problem is, what it consists of, what its causes might be, what a solution would look like, you have taken that thing out of the dark and brought it into the light where it can be examined and dealt with. Monsters lose their power in the light. Vague, unnamed dread is far more debilitating than a clearly identified problem with identifiable solutions. He talks about couples who avoid the difficult conversations about money, about sex, about the direction of their lives, about the things they resent or fear, and who find, years later, that the avoidance has hollowed out their relationship far more thoroughly than the difficult conversations ever would have. The unspoken accumulates, it ferments, it becomes resentment and contempt. Whereas the couples who have learned to be precise with each other, to say uncomfortable things clearly and listen to uncomfortable things carefully, have built a relationship that can withstand the pressures of real life. Rule 11 is one that Peterson is known for, and it has generated genuine controversy, partly because it is so easy to caricature. Do not bother children when they are skateboarding. The actual argument of this chapter is much more nuanced than the rule suggests, and it is fundamentally an argument about the nature of risk, danger, and the virtue of courage. Peterson opens with an observation about a skate park near his university where young men performed genuinely dangerous tricks on skateboards and rollerblades. Some people wanted the park shut down, wanted the dangerous activity curtailed. Peterson was struck by something different. The young men in that park were practicing courage. They were voluntarily putting themselves in situations of genuine risk, learning through the experience of danger what they were capable of, building the neural and psychological infrastructure that comes from facing and overcoming fear. He connects this to a much larger argument about what has happened to young men, in particular, in contemporary society. Boys, he says, have been pathologized for their natural tendencies, their aggression, their competitiveness, their risk-seeking, their rough play. Educational systems and social norms that were designed largely with the behavior of girls in mind have treated the natural behavior of boys as a problem to be medicated or disciplined out of existence. And the result has been a generation of young men who have been told, in 1,000 different ways, that their essential nature is toxic, that their desire to compete and take risks and establish hierarchies is pathological, that everything distinctively male about them needs to be suppressed. Peterson's response to this is both psychological and philosophical. He argues that the masculine virtues, courage, competitiveness, the willingness to take risks, the desire to establish and test one's place in a hierarchy are genuine virtues. They are not pathologies. They are the qualities that built civilization, that pushed boundaries, that went on dangerous expeditions and made difficult discoveries. To suppress them in boys is not to make better people. It is to make more anxious, more confused, and ultimately more resentful people. And he extends this argument to the idea of safety more broadly. Contemporary culture, he suggests, has become so obsessed with safety, with eliminating all risk, all danger, all discomfort, that it has forgotten the profound value of voluntary exposure to difficulty. Children who are never allowed to fail, never allowed to be hurt, never allowed to experience genuine disappointment, are not being protected. They are being deprived of the very experiences through which resilience, competence, and genuine confidence are built. This does not mean that danger is good for its own sake. It does not mean that children should be reckless. It means that a world from which all difficulty has been removed is not a safe world. It is a world in which people lack the tools they need to deal with the inevitable difficulties of real life. And now we are arriving at the 12th and final rule, and it is perhaps the most beautiful, the most honest, and the most earned of all of them. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. This chapter is in part about Peterson's daughter Michaela, who has been severely ill since childhood with a joint condition so painful and debilitating that it is almost impossible to imagine living with. She had surgeries, hospitalizations, years of pain. She was, for much of her childhood, genuinely suffering in a way that most people never experience. And yet, Peterson writes, she found moments of joy. She pet cats when she encountered them. She noticed beauty. She laughed. She did not, in the face of genuine and terrible suffering, give up on the small pleasures that were still available to her. Peterson uses this observation to build an argument about the nature of suffering and joy and how they coexist in a human life. He draws on the book of Job, one of the oldest and most profound texts in the Western canon, which asks the question, if God is good, why do good people suffer? And the answer the book of Job arrives at, after a long and searching and deeply honest confrontation with the problem, is not a logical resolution, but something more like an experiential one, a direct encounter with the reality of existence in all its terror and beauty, which is somehow sufficient. Peterson is not dismissing the reality of suffering. He has looked at it too directly and too honestly to pretend it is anything other than what it is. He knows that sometimes things are genuinely terrible, that life deals some people blows from which they cannot fully recover, that tragedy is real and not always meaningful. But he also knows that even in those circumstances, perhaps especially in those circumstances, there are moments when a cat crosses your path and asks to be petted, moments of unexpected beauty or connection or simple animal comfort that offer, briefly, a window into the possibility that existence, despite everything, is worth having. This rule is, in essence, an argument for gratitude in the most demanding sense, not the shallow gratitude of someone whose life is going well and who is grateful for their good fortune, but the deep, hard-won gratitude of someone who knows how terrible things can be and who, in the face of that knowledge, still chooses to notice and cherish the small good things that remain. And with that, we have come to the end of the 12 rules. But the book doesn't quite end there, and neither should this summary, because to end with the last rule would be to miss the deeper current that runs beneath all 12 and makes them cohere into something larger than a list of advice. The deeper argument of 12 rules for life is an argument about meaning. It is Peterson's answer to the question that Nietzsche raised in the 19th century and that has haunted Western culture ever since. If God is dead, if the traditional religious framework that gave human life its meaning and structure has been undermined by modernity, how do we live? What do we orient ourselves toward? What keeps us from falling into nihilism? Peterson's answer is not a simple return to religious orthodoxy, although he clearly has deep respect for religious traditions and the wisdom they encode. His answer is something more like this: the same ancient truths that the great religious and mythological traditions have always pointed to: the value of truth, the necessity of sacrifice, the centrality of responsibility, the redemptive power of meaning, are not dependent on any particular theological claim. They are woven into the structure of human experience and human biology. They are the accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations of people who had to figure out how to live, and the fact that we have largely forgotten or abandoned them does not make them less true. It makes us less equipped to deal with the unavoidable challenges of existence. The 12 rules are not, in the end, about self-improvement in the shallow sense. They are not about optimizing your productivity or getting a promotion or having a better body. They are about something far more fundamental: how to be a person who can stand in the face of the terrible reality of suffering and limitation and death, and still choose to act well, to speak truthfully, to take care of others, to build something rather than destroy it, to find the beauty in a cat crossing your path on a difficult day, and to let that beauty remind you that existence, in all its chaos and pain and bewilderment, is still extraordinary. Peterson wrote this book out of his own experience of suffering and confusion. He wrote it for people who are struggling, not the comfortable and the fortunate, but the people at the bottom of the hierarchy who have been told they have nothing to offer, the people whose lives are in chaos and who have no idea where to begin, the people who are looking for something to hold on to. And the thing he offers them is not false hope or easy comfort. It is something harder and more sustaining, a serious engagement with the question of how to live, delivered by someone who has thought about it longer and more carefully than most, and who genuinely believes that the answer is available to anyone willing to look for it. The book is dedicated, in its deepest sense, to the proposition that you matter, that your suffering is real and significant and deserving of serious attention, that the chaos in your life is not a sign of your unworthiness, but a challenge to be met, that the order available to you, if you choose to pursue it, is genuinely achievable, and that the act of choosing to pursue it, of standing up straight, of telling the truth, of taking responsibility, of caring for yourself as though you were someone worth caring for, is not just good for you. It is, in the most profound sense, good for the world, because the world is made of people. And every person who learns to stand up straight and speak truly and take responsibility for their own small corner of existence has made that corner better, has added a tiny increment of order to the vast ocean of chaos, has created, for themselves and for everyone around them, a slightly more livable world. That is what the 12 rules are for. Not to make you happy exactly, although happiness may follow. Not to make you successful exactly, although success may follow. But to make you, in the deepest sense, a person, a full, responsible, honest, courageous, meaning-seeking, truth-telling person, capable of facing the world as it actually is and choosing to engage with it anyway. And with that, the book is done. And you can let the words settle like sediment in still water, drifting down slowly through the layers of your mind to rest at the bottom where the real understanding lives. Your eyes are heavy now. The night is very quiet. The rules are 12. The argument is old and serious and kind. Stand up straight, take care of yourself, choose good friends, compare yourself to your yesterday, raise your children with love and limits, fix your own house first, pursue meaning over comfort, tell the truth, really listen, say what you mean, let boys be boys. And when a cat crosses your path, stop what you are doing and pet it. Good night.